Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Love of Wisdom Book Club. I'm joined again by Jon Robins, and this time we're discussing Bad Men by David Buss. This book covers the evolutionary psychology of domestic abuse, sexual deception, sexual assault, and other topics like that cross over with a lot of the things that me and Jon have spoken about previously. It's a really interesting and insightful book. To me, it provided a lot more clarity and depth than many of the common narratives around these issues, and it provided for a really good conversation. I do need to put a slight caveat in that the camera positioning meant that Jon's arm was obscuring my face on a few occasions. It shouldn't detract from the experience too much, particularly if you're only listening. But it was just a mistake, and these things happen. We're recording in a very small space, so that's unavoidable sometimes. It's also the second time recording it because there was an issue with the first time. So it was a different conversation, but it means that some might be missing. But yeah, it's a really good conversation, and I thoroughly recommend the book for anyone who's interested. So enjoy. So, this is going to be our second attempt at discussing Bad Men by David Buss.
Yeah, well done, Robin.
Yes, I take full responsibility for failing to press the button and losing one of our vocal tracks. But for the sake of the audience, we should probably roll back to the beginning. So, might have to repeat some questions, but I'm sure that given it's been a month, we'll probably cover new ground anyway, because I can't remember half of what I said last time.
No, I can't either, which is quite helpful, I think, probably.
Yeah. So before reading this book, how much had you come across evolutionary psychology as a discipline before? Are you familiar with the ideas and the basics of it, or was this all new to you?
Yeah, not completely new. It was definitely something I'd kind of come across, I guess, in kind of like news articles and stuff, and a little bit in just kind of general pop culture conversation, or like it crops up within certain trainings in your work. And then it's also something that to a degree is brought into behavioral economics, and I've read a little bit around that. It's an area that I found quite interesting. So yeah, like it's not completely new, aware of it, but this particular area of it is new. Yeah, I'd like not read anything about this before. So
I'm wondering, because we've spoken about domestic abuse a bit in the past, and I think that's part of why I suggested this book, because I felt like it tied in a lot to the topics we've been discussing, and I'm wondering how you felt reading this sort of portrayal of this understanding of domestic abuse. How did it fit in with your conceptions? Was it revelationary? Was it did it confirm things you already believed, or did it flesh things out? Sort of
it was really good for that, because like in one of our previous conversations I was saying that I felt quite often domestic abuse came from like male, well, I say male because mostly, but the abusers' anxieties, like, and their frustrations. But that was like pretty much kind of my theory. Whereas this really expanded, kind of gave some credence to what I was thinking in some ways, but then also opened other avenues of thought, but helped take that viewpoint that I already had and really kind of flesh it out a bit and give a bit more meat to the bones and explain why, like, that potential idea of anxiety, as it were, is kind of right in some ways, but actually it goes deeper and there's more around it than that. I found it really useful, actually, in general, and that lots of stuff is things in there that you often find with like behavioral psychology stuff and behavioral economic stuff. Like when you read about it, you're like, oh yeah, like that makes total sense. Like I already kind of am aware of that and think about that, but it's not at the forefront of your mind. And I think a lot of stuff that you learn in these kind of areas, because I do a lot of reading and like some presentations on productivity and well-being and things like that. And when you explore some of the things that works and the ideas, you're like, none of this is revelationary, but actually just bringing it to the forefront of your mind and being conscious about it helps you gain a bit of control and a deeper understanding. Whereas beforehand, it was kind of rattling around in the back. You had a vague idea of it and you were trying to apply it, but just clumsily because you didn't have the rest of the information, wasn't the forefront of your mind. And that's where I think this book kind of, with a lot of things that we're probably going to talk about, really did bring out these concepts a little bit more.
Well, I think you find that with science in general, like good quality science tends to sort of have an element of, oh yeah, that makes sense, rather than oh my God, this completely changes the way I view the world. Although there are some examples of that. It's not unheard of, but the sort of revelationary findings that would cause a massive shift in your worldview are few and far between, because most science is just sort of trying to understand what we're observing. And so I'm interested into it as to whether there are specific concepts within this that you thought were useful or had a sort of practical application. Because when I read this, I was like, this is the first explanation of domestic abuse I've ever come across where I've been like, this actually makes sense. Yeah. So yeah, what? But obviously it's broken into lots of different little bits. So I'm wondering what sort of sticks out in your memory.
Yeah, some of the bullet point headliners from it, as it were. So yeah, for me, I think the things that really stood out were around mate value. Which when you first, and I'm sure we'll come on to it, so just keep it as a brief overview, but when you first started hearing about it, it's kind of like, oh, that's like not very nice way to kind of think about things. It's not all fun love, but like actually it all makes sense, and it's actually a lot of stuff that we kind of are aware of and do day to day anyway. Well,
it has a implication in most people's mind, I think, of those sort of Facebook, Instagram, TikTok videos of people saying, "I'll rate this person from 1 to 10," and it is equivalent to that to some degree, but it's far more complicated than that. You know, it's that tends to focus on physical appearance, whereas mate value is not so formalized into a 1 to 10 scale. It's not necessarily explicit in your thinking, but there is a sort of subconscious tracker that's basically saying, this is probably someone who's of a similar mate value to me, or, you know, you sort of know that there are some people that you wouldn't ever be able to get into a relationship with. And I suspect that most people also know when they're in a relationship, they sort of have this feeling if they know they could do better as well.
Definitely. And that hits the nail on the head, isn't it? You got with mate value. So there's that one. We also have the mate guarding, which then starts to open up like ideas of the dark triad and how domestic abuse works as a result of that, of trying to balance those mate values and try and bring someone down to their level to gain control. That was another one that really stood out. And the overperception bias was another really interesting concept that came out of it, that really rung true. It was like, oh wow, yeah, like we all had moments where we've had that, but how that then can play out into sexual abuse was really interesting, and I found that quite useful when it comes to domestic abuse stuff and in general work.
Yeah, so we have
because we should probably go through those one by one to see what we make of them and elaborate on them a little bit. So you have the mate value, mate guarding, and the overperception bias. So maybe we could go through that in reverse a little bit, so that, because mate value and overperception bias come into play early on, and throughout, but the overperception bias becomes less relevant once you're actually in a relationship. And then mate guarding is sort of a later behavior, isn't it? It's not well, actually, I'm saying that, I'm thinking mate guarding likely has a relationship with the overperception bias, where I'd be very surprised if people don't start engaging in mate guarding behaviors before ever being formally in a relationship as such, just because if you're courting someone, then likely you would start to psychologically perform mate guarding behaviors, I would have thought.
And keeping an eye out who else is in the room, who else is interesting. But what was quite interesting there is you did the classic human behavior there of like, well, I box that there, box that there, box that there. And you're like, oh no, it's more complicated than that. like life isn't, it doesn't work the way my brain wants everything to work.
Yeah, that happens a lot. It's why I'm very, well, I'd say probably my most common used phrase when I talk about any subject with people is, I think it's more complicated than that.
Mine is, which drives my wife nuts, yes, but also no. Like the amount of times she's like, no, Johnny, that's not an answer. I'm like, but it kind of is. Like, yeah, you're right in some ways, but what about this other stuff? The overperception bias, like coming into that, then I guess what the story from the book that I really liked, that I think explains it really well. He was talking about how us men, it was only on men really, I think he looked at. I don't think he looked at women, whether it existed at all, even in women.
Well, no, because it was a comparative thing. The overperception bias was that men tend to overestimate the degree to which women are interested.
Yeah. You can tell it's been a month since we recorded it last, and then even longer ago since I last read it. But the idea is that males have an overperception of friendly women and thinking that there might be a sexual interest there. So a lady will just be thinking, oh, I'm having a really nice conversation with this person, but the guy is actually thinking she's into me. And that's kind of what we're hearing. And this is where it kind of comes into the mate guarding stuff as well, is if you're in a relationship with someone and your partner is just getting on with someone who's a male, and you're thinking, oh, are they into her? Like, sorry, is he into her? What's going on here? Like, is she wanting a relationship with him? And those anxieties are there, especially if there's already like cracks in the relationship. And anyway, in this story, in the book, the professor is talking about how one of his students, when he started speaking about the overperception bias, came up to him and started talking about how she was in a relationship with someone, and it broke down because she was a friendly, outgoing person, liked talking to people, and he was really struggling with that, but at parties and things. So in terms of, there was probably a mate value balance in there that wasn't quite right already, which fed into the anxieties that he was having about the relationship. But that kind of put it on steroids, and she was getting really fed up in the end of him feeling jealous of the conversations she was having with other people, and just like, no, there wasn't anything there. And so the relationship ended, and the professor was chatting to her about that and being like, yeah, though, that's an example of it. But what he thought was really interesting is when the conversation ended and he was walking back to his office, he was like, oh, I think she might quite like me. And then realised, was like, no, I've just fallen for it as well. This friendly female has been talking to me, and instantly I've been thinking, oh, she might like me. But obviously she doesn't. Like, there wasn't any part of it, but it highlights how easily, even being aware of it, like you can just fall into it. And only, it can only be for like a minute, 30 seconds before your rational part of your brain sometimes clicks back in and you're like, oh no. But it's just so easy when you are scanning all the time, isn't it, for what value is there in relationships and things. And if someone is showing you an interest, like, you are thinking, like, where is this interest, what level is it? And as a guy, the interest of sex tends to come in a lot higher, and did go into something more about that in the book, in guys' perceptions, but I've forgotten about that by now. You might remember.
Well, men are men. If you basically, there's the sexual conflict theory, which is that men and women's evolutionary optimum for mating is different. So for a woman to have the greatest chance of propagating her genes effectively, she is going to want to, because obviously women can only reproduce, they have the 9 month gestation, the birth, and there's a high period of dependency immediately afterwards, and options for non-physical dependency on mothers are very new technologically. So their optimum would be to find someone who can offer protection during the periods in which they're vulnerable, so pregnancy and immediate postpartum periods of high infant dependency, and someone who is genetically healthy, so someone who is likely to produce healthy children who are going to thrive, hopefully. Whereas men, their optimum for gene replication is to have sex with as many people as possible, because one, they don't have their minimum commitment is just the sexual act, and two, the more children you have, the higher the rate of hopefully the higher the rate of survival amongst them. And that might probably sounds weird to many people who are considering it in the current context, but although there's evidence of evolution speeding up, it still works over multiple generations, and it is something that, and evolution has happened over millions of years. And so in most of our history, that is going to have had to be at play, because children surviving at the high rates they do now is, again, a fairly modern thing. And so men are also more visual in their attraction, which is evidenced by the fact that men are like 97% of the market for pornography or something like that, whereas women are like 90 something percent of the market for erotic fiction. And that in the erotic fiction that women tend to consume, there is always like there's a top 5 or 6 professions, I can't remember exactly what they were, that women fantasize about, and it tends to be doctors, lawyers. I think werewolves were in there. Not that werewolf is a profession, but there's a combination of them having the sort of danger competence level that means that they would be protective, and symbols of status, but it's based on a sort of imagination and fantasy that tends to be more appealing to women on average, whereas men tend to be very visual, because men's only interest really in that regard, and I'd say only interest, it sounds reductionist, but the biggest concern for them would be, does she appear to look like she has good genes and is going to be capable of producing me healthy offspring? these aren't conscious processes. These are like unconscious motivations that are sort of ticking in the background and driving us. So one of the ways that plays out is in terms of what people consider attractive. Almost every evolutionary book that I've ever read has dealt with peacocks as an example.
Yep.
Because the only evolutionary explanation that's ever been found for the peacock's tail is that it indicates low parasite load and good genes. Because if a peacock can build a large symmetrical tail that is full feathered and showing no signs of disease, then that's probably going to be a peacock that can produce good offspring. And that has been such an advantage in terms of sexual selection that it has overridden the disadvantage of having a massive beacon on your back that says, look at me, and it probably impedes you in getting away from predators. So, I don't know if that's sort of the phenomenon you were referring to, but men basically people tend to like facial symmetry. They tend to look for cues to health. They tend to look for cues to personality as well. Secondary sex characteristics, because they would reflect fertility to some degree, or would come to symbolize fertility in some way. So you have, when you look at the research on what people find attractive, it ties in with this good genes evolutionary theory. And then when you look at male mating patterns, they tend to be far more visually focused. So is that the pattern you were talking about?
Yeah, definitely. No. That's definitely the pattern I was talking about. I'm glad you had the ability to like bring it in there in that way. So I think there's so many. It's hard to kind of stop it going off on different avenues, isn't it? Because you've kind of covered so much there around these concepts in the book. But I guess where we are going forward is around how that over perception bias can then start triggering the mate value thing, and you're kind of like, oh, actually, I quite like you, and you can start to become protective of something that you perceive as building that isn't building. And then for men that kind of coming on to like the dark triad, I guess it was, that can be high in Machiavellism, psychopathy, and narcissism, then if they find out, oh, actually she was just being nice, and that wasn't part of there was no sex thing there, can feel kind of hurt potentially, and then overcompensate with that from displaying controlling behaviors, or actually can just jump straight to those controlling behaviors because they are continuing to perceive that there's interest there and there's not, and that is putting then the female in a really vulnerable position by meeting that person and just trying to have a friendly conversation with them.
Yeah, and I think that one of the interesting things that was explored in terms of mate guarding behaviours, so mate guarding behaviours, for anyone who can't infer it from the term, is basically behaviours that are used to indicate to other people that this person is not available and to decrease the potential for them straying and for infidelity. But it can be very low level, like it could be putting your arm around your partner in public. It's something I've heard joked about a number of times, where people are like, oh yeah, when there's another man around, he tends to be way more affectionate, or things like that. There's signs of it, but it also could be seen as things like we wear wedding rings to indicate that we're taken. In India, the women wear bindis to indicate that they're taken. So there are loads of ways that we have developed as humans of signaling to other people this person's not available for a relationship. So mate guarding then scales, and I think what you were talking about is when that combines with the over perception bias, particularly when you have someone who has a dark triad personality, so is less likely to be concerned for other people, is more likely to see themselves as entitled to certain things, or as a victim, or generally likely to lack empathy. That those they basically lack the things that constrain the degree to which they can engage in these mate guarding behaviors, and they may start to escalate those, because I think the dark triad came up quite a lot during this book, didn't it, as a predictor for the likelihood of people engaging in these behaviors. And it actually reminds me of I wrote an assignment last year about, and I focused quite heavily on domestic abuse and borderline personality disorder. And borderline personality disorder tends to be characterized by significant anxiety and insecurity around relationships, and the rates of domestic abuse perpetrated by people diagnosed with borderline personality disorder are significantly higher than those without. And it ties into that fear of abandonment that basically is what this book is positing is the underlying motivation for domestic abuse, basically.
Yeah, sorry, I thought you had more going on there. No, definitely, you're right on all of that. And I guess that's kind of brings us to the point of bringing in the mate value and kind of how that works, I guess, into a relationship, doesn't it? So as you highlighted, that it's mate value is a lot wider than just kind of looking at like, oh, you know, the way it comes in, you hear quite often is like people are out and like, oh, she's a 6 or she's an 8, or like Zuckerberg when they.
As a teenager, did you play the game Fit Dirty Ginger?
No, I've not heard of that one. What was that?
That was a far more primitive way of ranking people, but it was basically they're fit, they're dirty, or they're ginger.
Brilliant. My wife's ginger.
And so, it's all right. We've already established she doesn't watch this.
Yeah.
But yeah, and teenagers used to shout it out when they passed someone. So shout out their verdict, whether that person's fit, dirty, or ginger.
That sounds horrific.
It's teenagers.
Yeah, it's teenagers in a
lots of things they do are horrific.
Yeah, but I mean, and so was that where I was going with the Zuckerberg thing that he created before Facebook, wasn't it? The hot or not on the website that you clicked.
I'm not
like
aware of this.
Was it hot or not? And it was like a scale of 1 to 10, and you rated people. He started off at uni, and he used the photographs of all the people in his uni. I think he hacked into the database and took everyone's photo and let people rate them out of 10. But then it just exploded and went like international, and people were even uploading their own photos onto it to like see where they were. And I remember this, you might have been a bit younger than me, because I remember just, it was probably like my first year of sixth form. So I would probably have been about 16, 17 when it came out. And like loads of people were kind of into it, because that age you are trying to work out, are you attractive or not? And at what level, what are other people finding? So it is very superficial at that level. And actually the book talks about it, isn't it? That as you're younger, you don't really understand your full mate value, and you are learning that. And they talk about the fear of jumping ahead again is why like older men can target younger girls, because they don't fully understand their mate value and their worth. So if you're older and you have a lower mate value, you can kind of manipulate that situation to end up in a relationship with someone that otherwise would have had a potentially higher mate value. Anyway, so that was there, and it's a very superficial way of finding out what a mate value is, whereas actually it's way more complicated than that. You're bringing in all sorts, but like looks is part of it, but it's like wealth and like potential for bringing in income for both of you. But as you highlighted, actually with the evolution of men and women, how it is actually women tend to be more wanting the male to be able to provide the resources. So there's a more of a wealth view on the man, but it still comes into play, and even more so in our modern relationships where both people are working and you're kind of building something more together. It's kind of changed that a little bit. There is a less of a fear, not fear of a looking at just the man holding the resources, but underlying, like in the background systems, as you pointed out earlier, it's still running in us, but and that's where that conflict of kind of evolutionary development and current social development is at odds. And I've gone on a side track again, but that's in there. Also just simple things like, do you get on with them? Like, have you got similar interests? Do they make you laugh? Like, can you do things together? Like, is conversation free flowing between the two of you? Like, all that builds up to a value for that. So you got two things, isn't it? A value that mate is to you, but also a value in the general population. Like that is kind of at play there because of some of those things. However, it does tend to balance out. So you will have people that are like high up on mate value, and you know you can talk about famous wealthy people like that. You know, you and me, like, we're just never going to end up in a relationship with, because they earn more money than we could ever dream of.
I'm still holding out for Megan Fox.
You're still holding out. Brilliant. Well, you do it there. But like, it's just like, it's an easy way of showing, isn't it? She is high mate value. Like, she's good looking. She's got like access to a lot of resources, etc. So your mate that value is lower. Like, it just is. But then you'll find, you know, a drug addict, homeless person who's lost their teeth, like, their mate value, you could probably end up in a relationship with them because your mate value is higher if you wanted to. Like, and that makes it sound so bad, isn't it? Like, oh, you can just put that person, I'll want a relationship with them. Like, it is, there's a degree of a two-way process here. It isn't just Robin chooses someone lower and like, you're lower, I'm having you. Like, yeah. but the odds is, isn't it? There's more likely that, you know, someone who is lower, there is a chance that you could build that relationship. The odds are higher than, like, if you met Megan Fox, the odds are a lot lower. And so you are overall trying to find someone that is of equal value to your mate relationship, and like just taking into account as well, like, future potential as well is a big one that comes into that. So you tend to find people on average mate value form those relationships and sustain them. But when you're in a relationship and the mate value was either never right in the first place but wasn't really noticed by one party, or actually during the relationship it changes, that's when you tend to get conflict that starts to creep into that situation, which is what I always described as like, oh, it's the anxiety about the relationship. But actually it's a little bit more than that coming into play, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that there's two aspects or two forms that mate value takes in that regard, because you've got your sort of self-perception of mate value and other people's perception of your mate value, and you would hope that those align reasonably closely, but they could not align, and quite often there are changes in one's personal life circumstance that precede a change in the relationship dynamics. So, for example, men are significantly more likely to initiate divorce because of a woman aging, because youth is important for female fertility, and attraction is based on genetic potential for reproduction, whereas women are far more likely to initiate divorce because of a man losing his job, because he then doesn't have the resources to provide in the way that he might otherwise. So you have this sort of point of conflict where someone's mate value potentially changes. And again, it could be a positive change, say the woman gets a promotion and is suddenly earning way more. That could be a positive thing and they could celebrate that. But for some men, that is going to trigger some form of anxiety because they're going to go. And I believe that for many men, some aspect of this will be conscious, but it'll sort of like a feeling combined with some conscious thoughts. But it might be, well, she's now going to go to this new job where she's earning way more, and she's going to be surrounded by all these other people who are also earning way more, and she's going to be meeting lots of men who are potentially better partners for her than me, and she's worth more than me, so as a mate, so potentially I'm at risk of losing her anyway. And so you can see how you get this cascade of like one event leads to a feeling, leads to these thoughts, and it just spirals. And that's when there's the potential for conflict between the two of them. And there are ways to manage that. And there are obviously loads of people who do manage it without it causing an issue. It's one of the reasons why I think that I've always, I say always is probably the wrong word. I would generally say, even if you have an insecurity that you know to be irrational, it's worth sharing it with your partner so that you can discuss it and establish that it's irrational, so that you change your concept of that emotion within your head to better predict their behavior. I've recently been reading a book, I haven't quite finished it, called How Emotions Are Made by Dr. Feldman Barrett, and she's a neuroscientist, and she's basically talking about the way in which emotions are constructed, because there's this common idea that emotions are universal, but there isn't evidence for universal emotions. There's also a common idea that certain areas of the brain are responsible for certain emotions, and that just isn't supported by the modern neuroscience evidence. But basically the idea is that our brains work by prediction. So your emotion is almost a prediction of what your brain thinks is going to be the best way to manage the situation that it's anticipating. And so if your inbuilt concept causes you to predict that you're likely to lose your partner in this situation, then you're more likely to feel that anxiety or jealousy. I'm giving a very vague overview of this because it's a different book and I'm going to do another podcast episode on it in the future. But so that conversation where you basically say, I'm feeling uncomfortable, I'm feeling insecure, I'm well aware that I'm an idiot and this could be completely unfounded, but we need to discuss it because you should know that I'm feeling that way. And you have the discussion and the person says, well, that's not how things are. This is what things are. This is my commitment. This is my position. This is how I feel. And then you can go, oh, okay, actually, and you update your concepts and predictions for what is likely to happen, and that should decrease the amount that you're likely to feel that anxiety or jealousy. So I've always would advocate for discussing irrational insecurities rather than repressing them.
Yeah. What I like there is that you decide that they're irrational, because like what I was thinking there is the alternative is they go around as like, oh, actually, yeah, you're totally right to feel that way. Actually, I am now feeling like I am enjoying my new life with my new resources, and these other people I am actually having a really good time with, and actually this relationship isn't working as well as it used to. Sorry. And then it's like, oh, actually that's come into play, isn't it? But it's really important that you had the conversation and called it.
Yeah. So what I mean when I'm referring to it as irrational, because it's definitely not guaranteed to be irrational. Yeah. You could be completely right, but often people won't talk about their insecurities because they'll presume them to be irrational, is what I meant.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, I understand that. So yeah, how's this? Well, bringing it back to domestic abuse and like so yeah, those mate values then, and you're moving around trying to keep them together. But it's a great example of what I remembered, and it came to me. I had an epiphany in the previous recording that we've then lost. But in my role, sometimes in our role, but in my day to day, I've found times where I've gone into an assessed situation with a family where domestic abuse is alleged to have been happening, and the partner in the circumstances I can think of has been the female, and it's because he's lost his job. Like, that's why we're arguing. That's why there's like, well, they'll say arguing, they won't go as far as abuse, and like that's why there's problems, and like this arguing, there has sometimes been physical like incidences between these couples, and they just be like, as soon as he gets another job, it would be fine. Now, traditionally, you're trained to believe like, well, no, like this person is abusive, like they are showing abusive traits. Like, the job, what's that got to do with it? Like, they're an abusive person. But what I think really helped with this book is actually that it all of a sudden made sense. Is his mate value dropped, his anxiety shot through the roof, and he was worried like around an insecurity in the relationship that it was going to break down. So, and but this the bits that we'll come on to, perpetrating the abuse to try and keep the partner. Now, again, that might have just been running in the background. They might not have been understanding those feelings and emotions, why they're acting that way, but it did. And then I've had in these same things, what has then happened is that partner has got a job. And then the lady's like, see, I said it was just a job. There's no more abuse. And you're like, is that really what's happening? There's no abuse now? Like, this doesn't feel right. But importantly, we run on evidence. The children aren't saying that there's any sort of domestic abuse. We're not getting reports anywhere. You know, I'm not knocking on the door and she's opening with a black eye and saying, no, there isn't a black eye. What are you talking about? Like, so it seems like it's dropped, and you walk away feeling quite anxious. And like, what is highlighted there is that the values have rebalanced. So there isn't a need, as it were, in that person to perpetrate that behavior. But as you rightly said, not everyone will like perpetrate that behavior. It's a certain group of men that seem to have that like predisposition into potentially doing that, whereas there's others that won't. Or it might even be that all men do. It's just you got to wait. There's got to be the right environmental factors around to bring that out. Not 100% sure, and I don't think that was really covered in the book from what I remember, but there's certainly men where it's more likely that to come out. And as we mentioned earlier, it's the dark triad, which is a real indicator of when it will, which is those people that are narcissistic. They just believe, you know, like, I am the absolute best, so why would you leave me? Machiavellistic, so they believe like they can control others and just see other people as people to
they
control.
Tend to portray themselves as a victim as well.
Yeah.
Machiavellians.
Yeah, and then the psychopathy, like they don't understand the emotions that they might be inflicting on the other person as a result. And when you bring those together, like, there isn't an understanding of like what the abuse is doing or why you shouldn't like be doing that. So it raises it through the roof. And yeah, I just found that was a really good example that I reflected on from my past and work. And I'm like, oh, wow, yeah. Like, maybe that abuse did die down and that family have lived perfectly normally ever since, and it's been fine. It was literally just those circumstances which caused it. And that's that importance, I think, of that mate value. And if you understand it, mate, I could have had conversations potentially with them. I still don't know how I would approach a conversation like this with a family, or whether I would. Like, it's the delicacy of actually being involved in someone's relationship and trying to talk about mate values on a day-to-day might not work. But having that understanding myself in assessments of working with families becomes quite valuable. And that's what I say, it like flashes out those ideas, because originally I was like, well, he's obviously anxious about the relationship and that's causing it. But why was he anxious? It was because the mate value had changed.
Yeah, and I think that it was sort of discussed in the book a couple of times, or it wasn't a big focus, where he basically said the vast majority of people do not perpetrate domestic abuse. It's a small minority of people. He was in that book, he was very focused on men as perpetrators, which is fair enough. That's his prerogative. But it is something that I think we've discussed before, that there is some evidence that women perpetrate at much higher rates than we presume. It just tends not to reach the same levels for a variety of reasons. But I think what you've highlighted there is key to why I felt this book was so important, because you've highlighted the deficiencies of other explanatory theories for domestic abuse. Because I would say the top two theories that are used in our field, in my experience, are the feminist theory approach to domestic abuse and the social learning theory approach to domestic abuse. And the feminist theory one doesn't tend to leave an awful lot of space for redemption. It basically says that men perpetrate abuse to retain power and control, and that because that's reflective of how society is structured and so on and so forth. But the evidence doesn't support that, because he explored this in the book, but basically there is no correlation between whether someone holds patriarchal values and their likelihood of being a perpetrator of domestic abuse, and there's no correlation between whether someone lives in a culture that could be deemed patriarchal and the rates of domestic abuse. So if patriarchal values, either culturally or individually, do not predict the likelihood of domestic abuse, then that theory falls flat on its face. And the social learning theory fails to account for people who were never exposed to domestic abuse but go on to perpetrate it, and people who were exposed but go on not to. And it just doesn't, obviously you never expect anything to be 100%, but the numbers just don't add up in favor of that being the mechanism through which people come to perpetrate domestic abuse. But what this basically, with this theory, we have the understanding that the same motivations and there's a spectrum of behavior triggered by a certain situation, that we all exist on that spectrum of behavior, and it just happens that due to human diversity, some people exist on the extreme end of that spectrum and are more likely to perpetrate domestic abuse, and there are certain indicators of that within their psychology. But what you also get from that is sort of this potentiality for anyone to be a perpetrator, but you also have the potential for any perpetrator to cease to be a perpetrator if the dynamic changes, because rather than being a completely individual process, and I'm sure that some people who love to take things in such simplistic terms will say that this is blaming the victim, but basically it's a dyad. There is a dynamic, there's a relationship between at least two people where that issue emerges, and actually there is the intervention for resolution can be on both sides. And one of the things that sort of sprung to my mind when I was reading the book, because I straight away go to practical application. What does this mean for me when working with people? You sort of speak about talking about mate value. Talking about mate value is probably a bit too far-fetched for most people and their day-to-day experience. And I'm not going to go in there as a professional and go, the problem is, mate, you're a 4 and she's a 6.
Work it out.
But what you can work on is communication between them and their self-perception. So one thing that it covered in terms of domestic abuse was domestic abuse is actually very effective as a tactic. And what was shocking to me is we know this. Like we know it because the evidence for it is, and these stats are always pulled up over and over and over again. It takes women God knows how many times to leave. I can't remember the figure, but most people say, you know, there's like 7 instances before they ask for help, or 50 instances before they leave, and so on and so forth. So we know that, and we know that there's a high rate of people leaving abusive relationships and returning to them. These tactics clearly work if their instrumental objective is to retain a mate, even if it's just for the short term. And also, how many situations have you encountered, and this is purely anecdotal at this stage, but how many situations have you encountered where a perpetrator of abuse, someone's gone back to them and a week later they're pregnant?
Yeah.
And that's sort of serves that purpose. But there are 2 points of intervention there where basically it decreases the woman's working with the framework of woman as victim again in this one, but say domestic abuse perpetrated by a man against a woman, it decreases her self-perceived mate value and externally perceived mate value as well, because people are less likely to want to get into a relationship where there's drama. If there's physical injuries, then it will reduce the level of sexual attraction that people feel to them. There's sort of, it does have that effect. But so then any intervention that works with the victim, that's sort of saying, actually, this situation is causing you to perceive yourself more negatively. Let's see how we can help to bring your self-perception in line with what would be your usual externally perceived mate value, although you wouldn't use those terms. You would probably use terms like self-esteem or something like that, but there are issues around the concept of self-esteem, but that's a whole other thing. But you would be focusing on that, and that would increase the probability that they would successfully flee. And interventions are focused on that already.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. That is a big part of it, because you need to get the guy out of the way who keeps like tearing the wall down every time you build it up.
But equally, you could focus an intervention on his self-esteem and his self-perception, and boosting that might decrease his feelings of needing to use such extreme measures for mate retention. I can see there being a real tricky conundrum there that would be hard to resolve, where basically you're like, well, if we're helping him to become less abusive and we're helping her to become more confident to leave, helping him is decreasing the probability of her leaving, but it's also decreasing the probability of him abusing her. And so that you end up in this sort of, there's a tension there of exactly how you do it, but there's also, and yeah, I think that ultimately that's going to be, I don't have any answers to that now, but I think it's something that will be so specific to each situation and will depend on where you're getting success with which aspect of the intervention. But also the communication between them will, like I was saying earlier about communicating your insecurities and things like that, you can work on communication in a way that is more likely to decrease the amount of conflict and the amount of insecurity leading to conflict.
Yeah. I think one of the things that, just following on that, like I've thought about reading, that I've been thinking about since reading the book, and our conversations are actually, how do we put this into practice to actually help people? I'm still trying to work that out as well, like as you are. But there's good points there. And it might well be that in that situation, actually, the relationship is done. You can't actually work with them both in that relationship for the conundrum you just pointed out, but you can start working with them outside the relationship to protect their next partners and their next relationships. So they're built for that. I think what you were saying there is really good and really poignant for those people that aren't really high up on the dark triads, because I think from what I've read and took from this, actually there are people that will just continue to abuse from relationship to relationship. There seem to be those people that actually you won't be able to manage in that way. I think the example like I gave of this guy, that when he got a new job, the abuse disappeared. Like someone like him was probably actually someone you could work with, because it wasn't a day-to-day abuse. It wasn't so ingrained in them that they needed to control their partner, that there was a value that they could meet and have met previously. Whereas there are some other people that actually, as soon as they're getting into the relationship, they're straight away trying to control, and they're quite high on those dark triads that probably those interventions might not work. But that brings me into another little bit. I think it ties together from something you were saying there around social constructive theories of domestic abuse. And this is only just something I thought of as you were talking. I haven't fleshed out the idea, but the idea that within that social construction, it tends to be the idea that someone has witnessed domestic abuse and therefore has been a victim of domestic abuse and had their own trauma. And if you're taking that trauma forward into adulthood, you are probably carrying emotions that lower your self-esteem and mate value. Again, it's in the background where that sort of stuff is running, that trauma is being carried forward. So as a result of experiencing that, your mate value has been chipped away at a little bit. And there could therefore increase the likelihood that you end up in a relationship where you domestically abuse. And that may have been why that link was made, but actually it's not as strong as we initially thought. It was not always an A equals B, as we know. Like, some people can go through that trauma and not abuse because actually they've overcome it, they understand it, or actually it didn't. They had other things that made their mate value higher, or they always ended up in a relationship with someone where the values were fine. Because I guess if you're someone that believes that they're a 7, goes out with a 7, but actually because of trauma is a 5 or a 4, and they can mask it really well initially, and then the person is with a 7 start to quickly realize that they're not, and then the other person's anxiety starts creeping. Oh, she's worked out that actually I'm not where I portrayed myself to be. Then the abuse comes out. Whereas you can get someone who's like, actually, I've been through trauma and I know it's affecting me and I know that I'm a 5 as a result. And if I hadn't had that in my background, I'd be a 7. Like, meet someone else who's a 5, the abuse doesn't come out.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things that is often cited as a impact of trauma as well is difficulties in emotional regulation. And if you're feeling your emotions more strongly, then you're more likely to act on the extreme scale of potential reactions for that emotion. I think one of the things that comes into play there as well in why the social learning theory doesn't quite work, and your explanation of trauma is potentially a far more valid one, is that I think we sometimes, like everything, oversimplify what it means for someone to experience trauma. Not everyone. So traditionally, the definition of trauma was, initially it was originally physical, and then it moved on to psychological, and it was basically something to the effect of, I'm going to butcher this slightly, but an experience which is so far outside of the ordinary realm that any reasonable person would be impacted by it long term. And there's been a lot of concept creep with trauma, where it now, at the extreme end of the concept creep, you have people claiming to be traumatized by so-called microaggressions, which are so small that they're undetectable by other people, but only known by the enlightened few.
They said a joke I don't like, and now I'm really hurting.
Yeah, exactly. And
Jimmy Carr said something inappropriate.
Yeah, and obviously I'm sort of it doesn't warrant going into too much. It's like a tangent, but I think that there can be this presumption that anyone who's witnessed domestic abuse has experienced trauma, And I would frame that instead as anyone who's witnessed to domestic abuse has experienced a potentially traumatic event. They have not suffered trauma inherently. And you will have a load of factors that contribute to that. Some people are more resilient naturally. Some people have a more stable affect that doesn't change as much and is less subject to the external world. Some people will have had enough other factors in their life that have provided them provided the resilience for that. Some people will have witnessed a very low level of domestic abuse compared to others, and some people will have been more directly involved than others. Some people have felt more agency in that situation than others, and all these things contribute to the probability of that person actually exhibiting anything that could constitute a trauma response. And so that complicates the social learning expectation of it as well, because if the social learning, like you said, goes, oh, A equals B, but actually what it seems to be is more like A plus C plus D plus E maybe equals B, as long as F, G, H, I aren't present or something like that. You know, there are so many factors that come into it, and it's not a linear route from A to B. All of those will affect whether traumas come into place. And the social learning theory seems to only work if A equals B.
Yeah, I mean, you caught me out in something I pulled you up on earlier. Was it? I hope it was recorded right at the beginning, where I said, "Oh, you've put it in two separate boxes," and then realised it's more complicated than that. And like I did in my point as well, didn't I? I was saying that as trauma could do this, A equals B. Yeah, then it's not. It is more complex than that. And I'm really glad that you raised all those points, because in our day-to-day and work, there are all the other factors that we do take into account, and the individual resilience. I was just kind of thinking of it in terms of why the social constructivist theory may have occurred and still people feel has legs and like it is relevant, because of that kind of confusion that may have been there. As actually it was a correlation does not always equal causation kind of effect, isn't it? And people correlate. They made a correlation of the two, and then decided that it must be because of the environment, but actually it might not have been. There's other factors at play, and they've just not taken that into account. It's taken longer to understand.
It's also intuitive, isn't it? And this is why lots of these theories persist. Like social constructionism has been pretty widely refuted in many different, but so is also the opposite of sort of genetic essentialism has also been widely refuted, and actually it's sort of some combination of the two. Biology and environment interact with one another, but people tend to intuit the environmental impact on behavior far more, because I've had this conversation in the office not that long ago, actually, and someone went, well, obviously if boys play with these toys and girls play with these toys, they're going to behave like this when they're older. And I'm like, no, it doesn't work like that. And there's numerous experiments that show if you give any boy a choice of toys, that they're more likely to choose these ones and girls are more likely to choose these ones. So it's not society that's imposing that on them, and actually there are lots of things that come into it, but it's very easy for people to go, oh well, A then B, so A must equal B.
I think what's happening is we're in society becoming more and more aware of the people outside the general. So we have like those general, like you say, most boys and girls, not all of them, but most. And that's the thing, but we're becoming more aware of the people on the outside of that. And then so that, there might be some boys that would be more interested in the dolls. Therefore, it's it's something that society has pushed on them. Well, no, it's not actually. It's that the most will do that. It's just that they have something in them that makes their genetic makeup is slightly different, and the way their brain is that makes them want that, which is fine, and that is fine. But the argument then comes into these people rightly have a voice saying, I don't want everybody to push me into only playing with the cars. Like, why is it all blue in the cars? Because I don't want to do that. I would like the pink and the dolls. And that's where we're kind of changing as a degree and being, oh, okay, actually those people over there, it was potentially wrong to push them that way, and actually just saying like, it's, you know, just choose which ones you want. But what is still relevant is the fact that most will still want, like, what is boys wanting cars, girls wanting dolls.
Yeah, and I think it's something that changed in many ways quite a long time ago, because when I grew up, the idea of a tomboy, a term that seems to have sort of disappeared quite significantly, but tomboys, it was accepted. No one ever got grief for being a tomboy. It was just like, oh, she's just a bit like that. She prefers mucking around and playing with the boys and all of that. There was potentially more of a stigma around effeminate boys, but also, you know, it was broadly accepted, and the research is very clear on this. The most sort of effeminate boys tend to grow up to be same-sex attracted, more so than masculine girls, for reasons which are currently beyond me.
Well, that's actually what I was going to go on to say with that example, is that quite often I think people cared less about girls being tomboys because often they as they grew up, they became more effeminate anyway. And actually, as young kids, you're more asexual, quite often younger, and like, so girls are exploring and playing and doing these things that actually are just fun. Like, so that's probably why there wasn't so much of a societal like, oh, actually what's going on there, like, you know, of those internal anxieties that potentially were ridiculous. Like, so it was but anyway, we strayed a little bit like from the topic of,
we always do.
We always do, it's good. But yeah, that's what I was thinking around with the social constructivist ideas, is potentially why that bore out. But the examples you were giving, I think, are really good in terms of potentially where there is room for intervention with perpetrators. As we discussed on previous ones, the perpetrator programs at the moment most of them are rubbish. And actually, where they do work, it tends to be on those people that didn't want to perpetrate the abuse or where they're perpetrating the abuse. So actually, they're really low on those dark triads already, and they're probably in situations where it literally is their mate value shifted. There was other influences on them, their other anxieties, and they were trying to cling on to a relationship that was dead and hadn't realized, actually, we spoke about this at the beginning, those creeping behaviors that start to creep forward in terms of mate guarding. So it might have been initially like, oh, actually, I'm feeling vulnerable in this relationship, I'm always going to walk with my arm around her like this. And then it was like, oh, I see her talking to that guy and they're having a good time. The girl, as we point out, perception biased, was just having a nice conversation. But us as guys are seeing that as she wants to have sex with him. And the guy that is outside the relationship is thinking, oh, she might want to have sex with me. Like, so, which is justifying in his head her behavior and making him think, oh my God, why are you doing this to me? Like, you're making him like think that you want to have sex with him.
Well, I don't think it's a coincidence that whenever we encounter any man who's controlling what a woman wears and saying what she can and can't wear, the justification is always based around how other men will perceive it. Exactly.
So that guy, those behaviors have crept through their own anxiety and the shift, and actually some people, it got further than they ever wanted, ever realized, and they were just trying to cling on to a relationship that wasn't working, and they just needed help to realize that. And that's probably the few that cause the abuse, and where the perpetrating programs work, because it was a product of their situation, as it were, and they just needed help. It's those other ones that actually are more worrying and we don't really know, and there was nothing that came out of the book for me that really stood out as how we can help them. And also it makes me wonder about, how what we haven't talked about is areas where men are purposely trying to, like, sometimes you find, I might be wrong here, but I'm just thinking of people that I've met, is actually sometimes if you got a guy who is high, might actually to me look like a 7 and is dating someone that is a 4, and the female being a 4, because why? Like, what's the kind of thing in there? Because it's turning that theory on its head, and I've definitely seen it, and they're perpetrating abuse to them. Maybe, actually, I'm going to answer my own question. They were more level, and it's the abuse that he's put on her. And this is the conversation you started to move on to, is actually why domestic abuse works. And that is really important there, is that actually it lowers that person's mate value. So just go full circle in my own head, maybe actually they were more level and he's lowered her down by causing the harm and the abuse, lowering her self-esteem. And how we see it play out, and it's a great example I've used in other conversations with people since, is like, if you were single and you saw someone who you quite fancied, starting getting on with them, but they've recently come out of this relationship, and actually that person is still trying to perpetrate abuse on them, you're like, oh, actually, this is potentially more hassle than it's worth, considering that person over there, mate value wise, is also like equal, but hasn't got this other baggage. So actually, I think I'll get on with her better, and it's fine. And so what's happened is that person's mate value is lowered. And you mentioned it earlier about pregnancy, and it's a really interesting one we see a lot in domestic abuse as well, is the domestic abusers sometimes try and keep their victims pregnant because it's lowering their mate value. And I've also remembered recently, when I was first started out as a social worker, it was a lady I'd met, and she was in a domestic abuse relationship, and she was really young, and she had 4 kids, and just her kind of understanding how it happened to her. Like, she was saying, I never used to be like this, and this isn't what I wanted, and I had these like dreams I was going to do this and this, but then like we just kept having kids, and like how her mate value had, like, as it were, dropped, because it's dropped because for most men, like, that going out with a lady that's already got children or a number of children, like, especially if they're young, they're not going to want another kid with that person, and the resource investment to look after her and the child is actually quite a lot. So there has to be some real other reasons why that guy wants to stay with that person, and there may be lots of other wonderful, amazing things about her that raise that mate value for that person to stay in the relationship. But it's also interesting, as you find that women that otherwise, if they didn't have children, their mate value would have been higher, actually end up going out with men where their mate value tends to be lower because of that. Actually, theirs has been lowered, which is why those tactics from the abusers work, because it prevents them going to other people, prevents other people becoming interested. And that one, the first example I gave about the person who was you saw in a club, but actually would just come out of a relationship that was abusive, that abuser is still blocking them from finding someone else. Like, he might walk over to you and be like, you know what, she's still mine, I'm going to punch you in the face, and you'd be like, oh, actually, this isn't worth it. I could beat you up anyway because I'm Robin, but I can't be bothered with this. And then because this person can't find anyone else, they're having their self-esteem, a phrase apparently not that keen on, like, lowered. It reaches a point they're like, I might as well go back. And that perpetrator is saying, you won't find better than me, you won't find better than me. And then it kind of almost seems like it's self-fulfilling. It's like, I told you wouldn't find anyone better than me. Like, but that's because you blocked her from finding anyone else.
Yeah, and I think that there's 2 things that sort of came out in that I can maybe offer some elaboration on. One is that in terms of mate value, as an individual external perceiver, we might see mate value very differently to the people within that dynamic. And it's inevitable that people will have, although there might be some relatively universal indicators of what people value, one of those things that mediates attraction is usually cues to personality. And so someone might value certain aspects of personality more than others, and there's inevitably going to be variability in terms of what people value in mates. Otherwise we'd all be chasing the same people. But women, there is, in terms of social status, women tend to be hypergamous. So women will mate across and up social hierarchies, whereas men, by virtue of the fact that women are mating across and up, men have to mate across and down. And so when you look at it externally, you might be like, well, that doesn't really make sense as a pairing, but they'll be judging each other against different criteria. And so what might be an apparent social status gap might not be a mate value gap because of the different things that contribute to that. And one of the funniest, that's probably the wrong word.
If you set up a horrible story with this will make you laugh.
It's funny in some ways, but it's also slightly depressing.
The best jokes.
On dating apps, you keep edging slightly over to the side, and I'm worried you're going to block the camera slightly.
Okay,
cool. On dating apps, I think women swipe right, which is yes, for 3% of men, while men swipe right for 60% of women. These are averages, of course. Some women will be more picky than others. Some men will be more picky than others. But what that tends to mean is that there's a small number of men on dating apps, and this is that hypergamy in action. There's a small number of men in dating apps who get loads and loads of matches, and the vast majority of men get almost nothing. And then the majority of women, although there are still some who get very little attention on these apps, but the majority of women will have a reasonable number of men to choose from. And so that's just an example of how the across and up, across and down pattern plays out in the most raw, stripped down version of the sexual marketplace that ever existed, which is dating apps.
Yeah. And that it's just reminded me of another thing that was spoken about in this book, that actually when we finished the recording last time, that has disappeared, like never actually happened. I was like, oh, we should have brought that into the conversation, was actually around short-term and long-term mating strategies as well. And that kind of comes into play in some of these relationships. And it could actually be that a short-term mating strategy like accidentally ended up in a long-term relationship, like and that could be in part of that problem as well. And because in a short-term mating strategy, guys are more likely to go a lot lower than they would otherwise, and because essentially guys just want to have sex quite a lot, like in general, and are prepared to, if they think that it's, and they did the studies around this. There was a brilliant one on campus with students where they had ladies go up to guys and just offer no strings attached sex.
Oh yeah.
And like overwhelmingly the guys were like, yeah, well sure, like, and kind of it mattered. There was a degree of how you would perceive the looks of the lady, and I think they tried it with different ladies that looked different. Like it would be kind of generally conceived hotter and less hot, and it was still very high in terms of men being like, well, yeah, if it's no strings attached, like no one else knows, why not? I'll meet you. Whereas the women were very much like, absolutely not.
If I remember rightly, they are asked 3 different questions as well. One was like, would you go on a date with me? Would you kiss me? Would you have sex with me? No strings attached. There was like or yes, it might have been more committed. It was something like that. There was a scaling aspect to it. And the more intimate it got, so once it got to sex, like I think women were literally like 0% yes rate.
It was above zero. It wasn't quite zero. There were a few. I remember listening. I think it was a podcast the author was on. I was hearing there was it was surprisingly there were a few.
Okay, I seem to remember it being zero for that, but then they were like, if you would kiss them or if you would go on a date with them, were slightly higher above zero. But maybe I'm wrong. It's been you read the book more recently than me, and it's been a while for you as well. So I think I read it.
I've been wrong plenty of times and may also be wrong again. So the reason why that kind of come into play is that we brought in as an example that has been a study done to highlight how men are more likely to adopt a short-term mating strategy. And it could well be that short-term mating strategy resulted in a baby that wasn't wanted by that male, and then societal pressures and everything else. And maybe they feel like, I'll do the right thing. And also like there is a degree of wanting to look after a kid with most people, not with everyone, like tried to kind of manage that relationship, but actually it became abusive, potentially the other way, because actually they were lower, they felt trapped in a relationship. I don't know, this isn't in the book and I'm kind of going off, and maybe actually the abuse kind of came out of frustration because the mate values weren't level. And could be where actually the theories of female domestic abuse might come into play that haven't been explored into this, but shoehorning it into the same theory is actually they start to perpetrate abuse on the male to bring their value down and keep the resources that they feel potentially they couldn't otherwise get from another situation.
Yeah, well, I was going to say abuse isn't inherently going to be focused on mate value in every situation, but it could be about, so the sexual conflict theory that I mentioned earlier, where I explained that women and men have different optimums. The basic idea is that conflict emerges in a relationship to try and force that tension and negotiation in one person's favor to closer to their optimum, because that's what people want. And I think that one of the things that plays into this aspect slightly, and would be probably negligent from not to mention, is that lots of these patterns emerge in other species. Because female and male, as biological sex is determined by the size of the gametes that are produced. So female in every species produces the larger gametes that are less mobile, and male produces the
what's a gametes?
Gamete.
Or gamete.
Gamete is the what's the term for it now? It's sperm or eggs.
Oh, okay.
And the terminology for it is escaping me right now. It's so
every species, the cell for a female is larger and the male is smaller.
Yeah.
So like sperm is smaller.
Mammalian species anyway.
Cool. Let's not compare us with something that's not got an invertebrate. That's the word. Yeah. Where's it gone?
So these patterns are seen. There are small exceptions, as there is with everything, where there are some animals where males are more sexually selective than women. But in all of those species, that's because the minimal parental investment for males, for a variety of reasons, is higher than it is for females. And actually humans, although we follow these same patterns, are the most mutually sexually selective compared to other species. So in other species,
chair away.
Let's just start making those noise. In other species, women tend to be almost solely responsible for sexual selection, and that's why we all see the things with birds making fancy nests and doing their dances and there's loads of sort of mating rituals that we see in other species, and people will probably be familiar with. But that means that in humans, compared to other species, men are more sexually selective in some regards. So the optimum between the two sexes, the gap that creates sexual conflict theory, is not as wide in humans as it is in other species. So you will see examples of the patterns going in both directions just because of the variability that exists within humans.
Well, I guess also is what I think is one of the things that make us unique in the animal kingdom as well, is we've got that theory of mind as well, and we can understand society more. So we mutually kind of have that understanding to bring forward of like what can happen if we have this relationship when alcohol isn't involved, and to be able to think further in the future, isn't it? And what will other humans think of this relationship, and how will that impact on my perceived like value in society? Like, so all those other things can kind of come into play on that situation, which is probably why there's a little bit more, or potentially, sorry, obviously not probably, I don't know, I'm making this up, like why there could be more of a balance there within our species, because there's all those other things that other animals, as far as we're aware, don't necessarily have, or at least to the same level we do.
Yeah, it's complicated, isn't it? Because it relates to consciousness, and consciousness is a very complex field. I don't think we have any time for. To be fair, I think we should probably start wrapping up, because I think we're approaching the end of our time anyway.
Yeah. And I think we've covered quite a lot anyway. I think, if anything, maybe there's areas that we haven't kind of touched upon where how this can lead to sexual assaults and things. But I think if you lump that in with ideas of domestic abuse, include sexual assault in that, then it kind of covers it, isn't it? That actually why they can happen in terms of, mate guarding, and also and abuse to lower their self-esteem and value, and also in the perception bias, like actually thinking that someone wants to have sex. And if you're high on those dark triad traits, you're going to think, well, I deserve it. You're clearly interested because you're talking to me, resulting in those sexual assaults, which is a happy way of ending it.
Yeah, and obviously once you factor in alcohol, which plays a part in, I think over 50% of sexual assaults, I believe, and the fact that it's a very small minority of people who perpetrate sexual assaults, then you get a pattern of sort of like disinhibition, personality combined with circumstance, combined with bias. But yeah, we've covered a lot of ground, and obviously people can read the book if they think it's got interesting points, because David Buss is far more competent than either of us are at explaining the things that he's been researching throughout his life.
Oh, he's fantastic. And even if you feel that you can't, you don't want to buy the book and can't spare that time to read it, which you should if you can, but like he's on quite a lot of podcasts, being interviewed, and again he'll be talking about this way more eloquently than certainly I have, and it's worth just listening to one of them for half an hour as you're driving around somewhere, or sorting out the dishwasher at home, and you'll get a little bit of extra insight there. But it is fantastic, and it's really opened my eyes to, not even the right way, it's certainly taken my understanding to another level and helped me in my thinking, and just adding something extra to my perception of the world, and why certain behaviors are potentially there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it exposes a massive hole in the practice, I guess, within social work, in terms of our understanding and just how much. I think there are many. This is one example of the many sort of areas where there is good quality research that's just outside of what is considered the standard view, that's promoted in social work that actually would give us a far better insight, and there is a long way to go in sort of finding and plugging those gaps.
Maybe not even just in social work, actually. In society in general, it's probably not really been pushed enough, because domestic abuse perpetrators programs aren't, I mean, loosely it's social work, but it's not under the title of profession social work, where there are people trying to create these programs and support people and understand that, you know, it's from government down. Like, we're putting in laws and things to try and protect victims and stop abuse perpetrators. But this understanding of why people might do it really needs to be brought into that more. And again, I still don't know. I have no idea reading this what the actual answer is to help those people, and it may well be actually the research of when domestic abuse perpetrator programs work on these people is actually the only way forward. And what that tends to be is, oh look, there's the alarm, we need to go, you weren't far off. It is just stop them having contact with women, like, and understanding what causes their abuse, or what underlying factors, like banning them from pubs if they know that alcohol is a real factor, and actually building literally a wall around them. But it's the costs involved in that, as has been proven, is ridiculous, trying to prevent someone from, you know, having relationships, as it were, and triggers into a whole new world of, like, is that right?
Yeah.
If they're that high level, like, should their liberty be taken away? Like, in terms, should they just go to prison? Or actually, if they haven't continued to perpetrate it because you're protecting them, then they should be. We're moving into a whole nother world.
Well, there's a whole ethical, like, there's a multiple trade-offs you have to consider in that, which is, where do you put the bar for being able to restrict someone's liberty? How much resource are you willing to put into preventing one thing when actually that could lead to increases elsewhere, because that resource could have been more effectively used? And there's loads of other things, but for another day, perhaps.
Definitely. I'm terrible at just like thinking of something else that just lands another bombshell of thoughts. So yeah. I'll stop talking before I do it again. Well, but anyway, a good conversation.
Yes, good. And I've recorded both voices this time, so Excellent. We'll actually be able to publish it.
Hooray.